Okay, a pleasant good evening to all. I will be your host, Ms. Stephanie Mr. Simon, alongside with Mr. Bradley Downer on today's episode of STEMMY Conversations. So today we have a special guest, and she is Dr. Michal Camejo Harry, who has a PhD. She is a volcanologist, and she is part of a scientific team responsible for monitoring volcanoes in the English-speaking islands of the Caribbean. So, Ms. Camille, it's a privilege to have you here today. So, could you tell us a bit about this profession that is called the volcanologist, and could you tell us a bit about yourself, please?
Sure. Hi, good evening to you and Bradley. Thanks for having me. So a volcanologist is just a long fancy word for volcano scientist. So essentially, I'm involved in monitoring volcanoes and also conducting research on them. So, and this is important in the Caribbean because we have a number of live volcanoes in the Eastern Caribbean. From the islands of Grenada straight up to Saba in the north. We have 21 live volcanoes in those islands, across those islands. So as you would expect, we would need to have a scientific team dedicated towards monitoring those volcanoes. In the Eastern Caribbean, we have a number of territories. So we have English-speaking islands, French and Dutch islands. So I'm involved in the English-speaking island monitoring volcano service at the University of the West Indies Seismic Research Center based in Trinidad. About myself, I'm a young volcano scientist, young in terms of I graduated with my PhD about 2 years ago now, almost 2 years ago now. And I am responsible, my monitoring job really involves monitoring ground deformation. So that means looking at how the volcano, the ground that is above the volcano responds in response to volcanic unrest or impending eruptions. So we may not be able to see at the surface the movement that accompanies volcanic activity, but we can deploy the specific sensitive instruments that can measure those small movements in ground movement, and we use that to help us to determine if a volcano is about to erupt or not. So yeah, I'll stop there and I'll let you go ahead with your other questions.
Okay, sure. Bradley, have anything that you would like to ask?
All right, so my question, I have two questions actually, would be how is STEM and ICT involved in or integrated into your career? And well, when you answer the question, I'll give you the other one.
Okay.
So yes.
So monitoring volcanoes involves a number of branches of physical science. Well, physical science and social science. So I'll talk about the social science a bit later on. So in terms of the physical science, specifically for the Eastern Caribbean, we deployed a number of instruments, geophysical instruments, to monitor volcanic activity. So before volcanoes erupt, they're usually accompanied by different monitoring signals that can be measured by instruments. So we look at volcanic earthquakes, which are monitored using seismometers. We also try to measure ground deformation, as I mentioned earlier, and we measure that in the Eastern Caribbean using GPS instruments. And we're also very interested in the geochemistry of the gases being emitted from these volcanoes, and as well if they have any crater lakes around the volcano. So that's where you would employ a number of geochemists, for example. And then because these volcanoes in our region don't erupt very often, you often have long periods of time where you don't have any background monitoring activity to actually record because nothing is happening. So in those cases, which is a lot of the times, you have to employ geologists to go into the field and try to map the past deposits of prior eruptions, so you can have an idea of how these volcanoes behaved in the past and that will help us to inform how they will behave in the future. So in most cases, volcanologists, or at least in the region, kind of fit a number of hats. So I did geology in my first degree, so I'm a geologist, and then I went on to I did further study in looking at the geochemistry of rocks. So, and then now I'm doing ground deformation monitoring. So we tend to be very multifaceted in how we, in our skills, because we work in a resource constrained environment, and because while we work in this agency, we get exposed to the different fields of volcanology. All of us scientists tend to have a small idea of what the other scientist is working on. So that's in terms of looking at the physical side of the volcano monitoring. More and more often now, we have seen the importance that hazards in general, how we have to try and explain the science to the people living near and around these hazards, because ultimately hazards influence the people living around them. So we have to have good people who are good at communicating the risk towards the regular people who won't understand the jargon that accompanies science. So that's where the social science aspect comes into it. So in addition to physical sciences, you have people who would have studied communication, risk communication, just to be that bridge between the scientists and the public. Yeah, so in terms of, you asked about STEM, the types of subject areas that you would need to get into this field is quite broad. You have the more hardcore, pure physical science, and you also have more of a social scientist. All of these fields working together to try and monitor hazard and reduce the risk to the inhabitants or people living in and around volcanoes.
All right, thank you for that. That was very well explained. So if someone wants to pursue this to be a volcanologist, what are some requirements that they would have? Like, I'm a high school student. What do I need to study? Or what qualifications do I need to have to go to probably with UE or whichever university you went to pursue these studies?
Okay, so I can give you my personal experience. So in secondary school, I would have done natural sciences. So for CXC, I did, and CAPE, I did, well, CXC, biochem, geography, physics, math, and then at CAPE, I did biochem, geography. I would, in hindsight, I would recommend doing more maths, like more ad maths and further maths, because now, as I'm an adult, I recognize that I am very weak in maths, and it becomes very handy in doing the types of work I'm involved in right now. So I would say one thing I would regret not doing more of is mathematics, but it's not necessary to get into the field. It's just useful and helpful for when you do further study. And then at UE, so I went to UE in Mona in Jamaica for my undergraduate degree in geology. So I did geology, and my minor is in environmental chemistry. And then after that, I have my master's in geophysical hazards. And the requirements for that, I did that at UCL, which is in London. So there were all kinds of people who would have done that course. There are people who did geology like me, and there were also physical geographers who would have gotten into that field looking at the hazard. And then for my PhD, I specialized in volcanology. So I would say to get into the field, yes, you probably need to do some hardcore science, but it depends on the aspect of volcanology that you're interested in, which will determine which subjects you focus on. So if you like chemistry, you do chemistry, and then you could focus more on the geochemistry aspect of things. If you're interested in more geophysics, you could do courses like physics and mathematics to do more of the geophysical, like monitoring tools that we would use in monitoring. And then of course, the more unconventional ways of getting into the field is people who do more communication and social science later on. But I think most people, when they try to get into the field of, when they end up getting into the field of volcanology, they don't think, oh, I want to be, or at least in my case, I wasn't sure that I wanted to be a volcanologist at the time. I just knew I liked physical geography, and I kept doing things that I liked. And then eventually I narrowed down specifically volcanology along the way, but I would say just doing hardcore science and then narrowing it down as you go along. But generally, yeah, maths, physics, chem, geography. Those are good subjects to do at secondary school to get into this field.
Okay, thank you for that insight. You actually explained the different subjects needed and the diverse careers or the diverse paths that you can take within this field. So thank you. Over to you, Stephanie.
Okay, so we had a bit of the insight here. So what advice would you give to some of the younger folks that are coming up and would be interested in this field that you're in?
So I would say, well, if you're interested and you feel that from a young age, I would say good for you. It's good that you know at a young age what you want to do already in life. I would say I know a lot of people, including myself, who don't know what they want to do when they're very young. But my advice would be to just, if you know what subjects you like, try to do those, and then hopefully along the way you end up where you need to be. I think it's important to do what you like, because later on, especially if you want to do postgraduate work, that journey into PhD life is very strenuous. So there are times when you feel like you'll want to drop out, but if you know at the back of the mind that you love this particular field, it really helps to keep you on the course. In terms of other advice for getting into this kind of field, you need to not be afraid of the outdoors for volcanology. So you have to, the field involves going out into the field, hiking up volcanoes, so like high topography areas to do field work, to collect samples. So you have to have a certain level of fitness and you can't really be afraid of hot sun. So initially, when I first started to work at the Seismic Research Center, I was not really an outdoors person, even though I would have done geology at university. We did some field work, but I wouldn't say that I love being outside. But the job really forced you to embrace, for me to come out of my comfort zone and embrace being outside. And now I can hike up volcanoes. So, I mean, it takes a while, but you know, after a while you get into a level of fitness which is required to do the field, because we don't have the resources to employ helicopters to take you often up to the different parts of the volcano to do field work. So you often have to walk to the different parts to do the field work. And yeah, you have to have some certain level of fitness, and you need to, you know, not be afraid of insects and being outside and sweating and those kinds of things. What else would I advise? I don't know. I think it's a very exciting field. You get to travel to lots of new and exciting places. I mean, I think volcanoes are beautiful, landscapes are very beautiful. And in the Eastern Caribbean, we have a number of islands with these beautiful landscapes. So the job that I'm in allows me to travel to those different islands to do field work to help maintain the monitoring network. So I visited a number of islands in the region. So I think that's an exciting part of the job as well. So if you're interested in this kind of field, you would get to see new and exciting landscapes. And also not just the physical landscape, you get to interact with the people living there and the people who are actually living with these hazards. So I live in Trinidad, we don't have volcanoes. As a scientist, I'm very excited to see the volcanic landscapes, but only when you get to these islands, you realize that you have to have a different kind of appreciation for the people who are actually living there. I can give you a story. One time I went to the island of Montserrat for a conference, and I remember being so excited to be there just to see the devastation caused by the eruption that happened many years ago. And I think at one point I would have come across a bit insensitive to some of the locals who were living there, because I was expressing all of my excitement. We'll look at all of these deposits, and then I forgot that, you know, these people would have gone through devastation that I would never have experienced in my life. They would have lost their property, they would have lost loved ones. And I was a bit insensitive to that fact, because I was so excited just to be there and to see, you know, the physical expression of the volcano. So I think in addition to seeing the physical landscape, you get to meet people, you get to hear their experiences and appreciate a different aspect of volcanic hazards just by interacting with the people that are there.
Okay, so this is a pretty adventurous job. You get to go places. Well, like for me, I'm a bit afraid of heights, so should I decide to venture out in that field, I gotta overcome that.
I would say yes. I'm also afraid of heights. Like I'm still afraid of heights. Yeah, and you just have to conquer your fear. Even though I've done it a few times, I'm still, afraid. But this job really challenges you to step out of your comfort zone. So I would say even if you're afraid of heights, go for it. And you're not in this alone. You're always out with a team. So having good supports in the field with your colleagues also helps with conquering your fear. So I would say that is not a reason not to get into the field at all, being afraid of heights.
Okay, cool. Let's see, Bradley.
Hi again. So, I've heard of the word or the career volcanologist. A while back, we had a representation from my church, and I just googled the definition, tried to understand what the definition meant, and explained it to a bunch of kids. But tonight, this conversation, you gave me a deeper insight of the many roles a volcanologist would play and the various careers within that field. So, Miss Michelle, I'm saying thank you so much for expounding on what you do and the advice given for younger folks out there who might want to pursue this because I love chemistry, that I can tell you, right? And who knows, I might end up going into that field too. So, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, at least for my career path, you never know where life will take you. So, like I did geology because I like geology. I have a minor in chemistry, but I never really liked chemistry that much, even though I did it at, CXC and CAPE. I did it because I think it's important to have if you're doing science, but I never really liked it. And then, you fast forward so many years later and chemistry is still an important part of your life. So you never know where your life choices will take you and what field you would end up. So life is just funny that way.
Correct. Well, for me, I love chemistry. I love the lab part of it. Earlier you mentioned math. I dislike math. I'm being serious. But over the years, even though I dislike it, I've come to kind of love it in a sense. So it's like a love-hate situation. But like you mentioned, if whichever career path you would want to go to, especially if you want to field in volcanology, I would say, based on your explanation, sharpen your math skills.
Yeah.
And as much as it might not be fully needed, it's still good to sharpen those skills because you don't know where life may take you.
It is because, when you're in secondary school, you have the time to go through the maths slowly and to learn it, and it just becomes part of your foundation. When you're trying to learn maths as an adult and you have less time and you don't have people to go through it with you at the same slow pace, it's a lot harder. And that's exactly what happened to me. I remember after I finished CAPE, I took a year off before going to university, a gap year. And I decided I needed to go back and learn some math. So I did some private lessons with a tutor. And it wasn't the same as doing it in school. It's not the same slow pace that the teachers will go through in school. And even now, I find myself, YouTube is my friend to help me with some of the math things because, and then you don't have the time to go through it in details. So you kind of ratchet your way and you have an idea of what you're doing, but secondary school is really where you get that foundation for the rest of your life, really. And that's where you have the time to put in the effort. So if you can, if you, I would say do maths because you could, even not only in this field, in other fields as well, I'm sure maths becomes very important in many fields of science. So.
Correct. I recall when I started to pursue my degree, my diploma in computer science. I didn't do KEEP, but I did CXC, and my lecturer was like, "We're doing engineering mathematics," and in my head, I'm like, "What is he doing to me?" Because I dislike maths, and at that point, I told myself that here's what you've got to, even though you hate it or dislike it, you've got to also love it at this point in your life because he showed the ways in which math can be applied to computer science. And like you mentioned, it's not just in your field. I think it's much in almost every field that we have to do today. It might not be calculus, it might be basic addition and subtraction, but it's still needed in almost every field out there.
Yeah, exactly.
Over to you, Steph.
Okay, well, this was a very interesting interaction, Dr. Michal. It is a privilege, and I thank you so much for finding the time to have this talk with us about your career as a volcanologist. And I hope that our viewers have a better understanding and appreciation for this particular career, because not a lot of persons know about it. When they hear the word, yes, the first is going to come to mind is volcano, but there's more to what meets the eye here. So
yeah,
thank you once again.
Thank you for having me. And the important thing is that, you can have these careers in our region. Like, I don't think as a child, well, when I was younger, that I knew that, we had volcanoes in the region and we could do these kinds of exciting careers just right here in the region. And I'm sure that's true for other careers that we just don't know. So it's good to be here and to talk to people so they can get an idea of what other, unconventional careers we have right here in the Caribbean. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. And that's a wrap, guys. So thank you once again, Dr. Michal Camejo, for joining us. Remember, guys, to subscribe to our Facebook page, STEMMY Conversations on Instagram, TikTok, and on Anchor.